Hello. Starting at page 294. A month after the day on which he had read the letter addressed by Odette Forcheville, Swann went to a dinner with the Verdurins, which they were giving in the Bois. As they were preparing to leave, he noticed the confabulations between Madame Verdurin and several of the guests, and thought he heard them reminding the pianist to come to a party at Chateau the next day. Yet he, Swann, had not been invited. The Verdurins spoke in low voices and in vague terms, but the painter, probably inattentive, exclaimed, "There must be no lights on which he must play the Moonlight Sonata in the dark, so we can watch how things become illuminated." Madame Verdurin, seeing that Swann was 2 steps away, now wore that expression in which the desire to make the person who is talking be quiet and the desire to maintain a look of innocence in the eyes of the person who is hearing neutralize each other, and an intense nullity of gaze, in which the motionless sign of intelligence and complicity is concealed beneath an innocent smile, and which, in the end, being common to all those who find themselves making a social blunder, reveals it instantly, if not to those making it, at least to the one who is its victim. Odette suddenly had the desperate look of someone who has given up fighting the crushing difficulties of life, and Swann anxiously counted the minutes that separated him from the time when, after leaving the restaurant during the drive home with her, he would be able to ask her for an explanation, persuade her not to go to the chateau the next day, or to see that he was invited, and to soothe in her arms the anguish he was now feeling. At last the carriages were sent for. Madame Verdurin said to Swann, "Well now, goodbye. We'll see you soon, I trust," attempting by the amiableness of her gaze and the constraint of her smile to keep him from realizing that she was not saying to him, as she had always done until now, "Tomorrow then, at Chateau, the day after at my house." Monsieur and Madame Verdurin made Forcheville get in with them. Swann's carriage had pulled up behind theirs, and he was waiting for theirs to leave so that he could help Odette into his. "Odette, we're taking you home," said Madame Verdurin. "We have a little spot for you here next to Monsieur de Forcheville." "Yes, madame," answered Odette. "What? I thought I was driving you home," cried Swann, saying what had to be said without dissembling. Because the carriage door was open, the seconds were numbered, and he could not go home without her in his present state. "But Madame Verdurin asked me, 'Now you certainly can't go home alone. We've let you have her to yourself often enough.' 'Now you certainly can go home alone. We've let you have her to yourself long enough.' 'But I had something important to say to Madame.' 'Well, you can write it to her in a letter.' 'Goodbye,' Odette said, holding out her hand. He tried to smile, but looked utterly crushed. 'Did you see the way Swann permits himself to behave with us now?' said Madame Verdurin to her husband, when they were back at home. 'I think he was going to eat me alive because we were taking Odette with us. It's quite unseemly, really. Let him just say outright that we're running a house of assignation. I don't understand how Odette can tolerate such behavior. He absolutely seems to be saying you belong to me. I'm going to tell Odette what I think. I hope she'll understand.' And she also added, a moment later, angrily, 'No, really, the vile creature,' without realizing it, and perhaps responding to the same obscure need to justify herself, like Francois at Cambrai when the chicken did not want to die, the same words which the last twitches of an inoffensive animal in its death throws ring from the countryman who is killing it. And when Madame Verdurin's carriage had left Swanns, came forward. His coachman looked at him and asked if he was not ill or if there had not been an accident. Swann sent him away. He wanted to walk, and he returned home on foot through the bois. He talked to himself out loud in the same slightly artificial tone he had always used when he enumerated the charms of the little clan and extolled the magnanimity of the Verdurins. But just as Odette's conversation, smiles, kisses became as odious to him as he had once found them sweet, if they were addressed to another man, in the same way the Verdurin salon, which only recently had still seemed to him amusing, inspired with a real enthusiasm for art and even a sort of moral nobility, now that a man other than himself was the one Odette was going there to meet, to love. Without restraint, exhibited to him its obscurities, its foolishness, its ignominy. He pictured to himself with disgust the next day's soirée at Chateau. The idea of going to Chateau anyway, like drapers after shutting up shop. These people are sublimely bourgeois. They can't really exist. They must have come out of La Biche Comédie. The Cotards would be there, maybe Brichot. It's quite grotesque, the lives of these non-entities. Always in each other's pockets like this, they would feel utterly lost, I swear, if they didn't all meet up again tomorrow at Chateau. Alas, the painter would be there too. The painter who enjoyed matchmaking would invite Forcheville to come to his studio with Odette. He could see Odette in clothes far too formal for this country outing, because she's so vulgar, and worst of all, the poor little thing, such a fool. He could hear the jokes that Madame Verdurin would make after dinner, jokes which, whoever the bore might be at whom they were aimed, had always amused him because he saw Odette laughing with him, almost inside him. Now he felt that perhaps they would be making Odette laugh at him. What fetid humor! He said, twisting his mouth into an expression of disgust so powerful that he felt the muscular sensation of his grimace even in his neck, flung back against the collar of his shirt. Now how can a creature whose face is made in the image of God find anything to laugh about in those nauseating jokes? Any nose of any delicacy at all would turn away with horror so as not to allow itself to be offended by such musty colors. It's really incredible to think a human being could fail to understand that, by permitting herself to smile at the expense of a fellow human being who was loyally reaching out his hand to her. She is sinking down into a mire from which it will be impossible, even with the best will in the world, to rescue her. I live too many miles above the swamp in which these vermin are gabbling and wallowing to be splattered by the jokes of a Verdurin, he cried, lifting his head, proudly throwing back his shoulders. As God is my witness, I have honestly tried to pull Odette out of there and lift her into a nobler and purer atmosphere. But no human being has more than just so much patience, and mine is exhausted, he said to himself, as if this mission to tear Odette from an atmosphere of sarcasm dated from further back than the last few minutes, and as if he had not taken it upon himself only when he thought perhaps these sarcasms were aimed at him, and were attempting to separate Odette from him. He could see the pianist preparing to play Moonlight Sonata, and the faces Madame Verdurin was going to make as she grew dismayed at the harm that Beethoven's music was going to do to her nerves. "Idiot liar," he exclaimed, "and the woman pretends to love art." She would tell Odette, after having adroitly insinuated a few words of praise for Forcheville, as she had often done for him. "Make a little room next you for Monsieur de Forcheville. In the dark, the pimp, the procuress." Procuress was also the name applied to the music that would invite them to be quiet, to dream together, to look at each other, to take each other by the hand. He found There was some good to be said for the severity towards the arts displayed by Plato, by Bossuet, and by the old school of French education. In fact, the life one led at the Verdurins, and which he had so often called real life, seemed to him the worst of all, and their little clan the lowest of social circles. It really is, he said, the lowest thing on the social ladder, Dante's last circle. No doubt about it, the next venerable text refers to the Verdurins, really the fashionable folk, whom one may vilify, but who all the same are different from these gangs of riffraff, show a most profound sagacity in refusing to know them, or even to dirty the tips of their fingers with them. What sound intuition is there in the Faubourg Saint-Germain's Nulli Métangère? He had long since left the avenues of the Bois. He had nearly reached his house, and still not yet sobered from the pain and the insincere exuberance with which the deceitful intonations and the artificial sonority of his own voice, pouring into him more abundantly every moment, had intoxicated him. He continued to perorate out loud in the silence of the night. Society people have their faults, as no one knows better than I do, but all the same, really these are people for whom certain things are out of the question. For instance, one fashionable woman I knew was far from perfect, but all the same she really had a basic decency, a sense of honor in her dealings that would have made her incapable, whatever the circumstances, of any sort of treachery, and which is quite sufficient to put a vast gulf between her and a vixen like Verdurin. Verdurin, what a name! Oh, one may truly say they are ultimate, perfect specimens of their kind. Thank God it was high time I stopped condescending to mix in utter presumptuousness with such infamy and such excrement. But just as the virtues he had attributed that same afternoon to the Verdurins would not have been enough, had they even really possessed them, but had not encouraged and protected his love to evoke in Swann that intoxication in which he was moved by their magnanimity, and which, even if it was propagated through the other people, could only come to him from Odette. In the same way, the immorality that he now saw in the Verdurins, had it been real, would have been powerless had they not invited Odette with Forcheville without him to unleash his indignation and cause him to vilify their infamy. And no doubt Swann's voice was more perceptive than he was himself when it refused to pronounce these words, filled with disgust for the Verdurin social circle and joy at being done with it otherwise than in an artificial tone, and as if they were chosen to appease his anger rather to express his thoughts. The latter, in fact, while he was indulging in these invectives, were probably, without his even noticing it, occupied with a completely different object, for, once he reached home, scarcely had he closed the carriage gate behind him, then suddenly he struck himself on the forehead, and opening up the gate again, went out, exclaiming in a natural voice this time, "I think I know a way of getting invited to the dinner at Chateau tomorrow." But the way must have been a poor one, for Swann was not invited. Dr. Cottard, who, summoned on the country on a very serious case, had not seen the Verdurins for several days, and had not been able to go to Chateau, said, the day after that dinner, as he sat down at the table at their house, "Why, won't we be seeing Monsieur Swann this evening? He is certainly what you would call a personal friend of—" "Why, I should hope not," cried Madame Verdurin. "May the Lord preserve us from him! He's deadly dull, stupid, and ill-mannered." At these words, Cottard showed surprise and submission at the same time, as though confronted with a truth contrary to everything he had believed up to then, but irresistibly obvious, and lowering his nose nervously and timidly into his plate, confined himself to answering ah, 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 traversing along a descending scale in his forced but orderly retreat to the depths of himself, the entire register of his voice. And at the Verderins, Swann was never mentioned again. I'm gonna try to clean the camera. 1 second. I think it's about the same. I'm sorry. Okay. Here there is a break in the page, and we're going on to a new section. We are past the Verderins. 1 second. So the salon, which had brought Swann and Odette together, became an obstacle to their meetings. She no longer said to him, as she had in the early days of their love, "We'll see each other tomorrow night anyway. There'll be supper at the Verderins. But we won't be able to see each other tomorrow night. There's a supper at the Verderins." Or else the Verderins were to take her to the Opera Comique to see Une Nuit de Cléopâtre, and Swann would read in Odette's eyes a fear that he would ask her not to go, which once upon a time he would not have been able to keep himself from kissing as it passed over his mistress's face, which now exasperated him. "It's not anger, however," he said to himself, "that I feel when I see she wants to go and scratch about in that excremental music. It's sorrow, not for myself certainly, but for her, sorrow at seeing that after more than 6 months of living in daily contact with me, she has not managed to change enough to eliminate Victor Mas spontaneously, especially for not having come to understand that there are evenings when a person of any subtlety must know how to give up a pleasure when one asks it of her. She ought to know how to say 'I won't go,' if only by using her intelligence, since it is based on the basis of her answer that one will rate once and for all the quality of her soul. And having persuaded himself that it really was only in order to be able to pass a more favorable judgment on Odette's spiritual value that he wanted her to stay with him that evening instead of going to the Opera Comique, he presented her with the same reasoning, with the same degree of insincerity as he had presented it to himself, and even with 1 degree more, for now he was also responding to a desire to capture her through her self-love. "I swear," he said to her for a few moments before she left for the theater, "that in asking you not to go, my every wish, if I were selfish, would be for you to refuse me, because I have 1,000 things to do this evening, and I will find myself trapped and thus quite annoyed if, against all expectations, you answer me that you won't go. But my own occupations, my own pleasures aren't everything. I have to think of you. There may come a day when, seeing me gone from you forever, you will be justified in reproaching me for not having warned you in this crucial moment, when I sensed that I was going to bring down upon you one of those sincere judgments against which love cannot resist for long. You see, Une Nuit de Cléopâtre, what a title, doesn't really matter. What we must find out is whether you are really that creature which ranks low in mentality and even in charm, the contemptible creature who is incapable of giving up a pleasant thing. Now, if this is what you are, how could anyone love you? for you're not even a person, a clearly defined entity, imperfect but at least perfectible. You're only a formless stream of water running down whatever slope one offers it, a fish without memory or reflection which, as long as it lives in its aquarium continuing to make the glass for water, will bump against it 100 times a day. Do you understand that your answer will have an effect? I won't say of making me stop loving you immediately, of course, but of making you less attractive in my eyes. When I realize that you are not a person, that you're lower than all other things, that I can't place you above any of them. Obviously, I would have preferred to ask you as a thing of no importance to give up une nuit de Cléopâtre. Since you oblige me to soil my lips with that despicable name, in hopes that you would go away. But since I've decided to tally such an account, derive such consequences from your answer, I thought it would be more honest to let you know. For some time, Odette showed signs of agitation and uncertainty, although she failed to grasp the meaning of this speech. She did understand that it might belong to the category of scoldings and scenes of reproach or supplication, and her familiarity with men enabled her, without paying attention to the details of what they said, to conclude that they would not make such scenes if they were not in love, that since they were in love it was pointless to obey them, that they would be only more in love afterward. And so she would have listened to Swann with the utmost calm if she had not seen that time was passing, and that if he talked much longer, she would, as she told him with a smile that was tender, obstinate, and unabashed, end by missing the overture. On other occasions, he told her that the one thing that was more likely than anything else to make him stop loving her was that she would not give up lying. Even from the point of view of your desire to be attractive, he told her, don't you understand how much of your charm you lose when you stoop to lying? With one confession, think how many faults you could redeem. Really, you are much less intelligent than I thought. But it was in vain that Swann expounded for her thus all the reasons she had for not lying. They must have undermined some general and systematic approach to lying, but Odette had none. She merely contented herself, whenever she wanted Swann not to know about something she had done, with not telling him about it. And so lying for her was an expedient of a particular order. The only thing that could decide whether she ought to make use of it or confess the truth was a reason of particular order too, the greater or lesser likelihood that Swann might discover she had not told the truth. Physically, she was going through a bad phase. She was growing stout, and the expressive and doleful charm, the surprised and dreamy glances she had once had seemed to have disappeared with her first youth, so that she had become so dear to Swann at the moment, as it were, when he found her in fact much less pretty. He would look at her for a long time, trying to recover her charm, the charm he had once seen in her, and he would not find it. But knowing that under the new chrysalis what lived on was still Odette, the same will, a vase evanescence, elusive and guileful, was enough to make Swann continue to put the same passion into trying to capture her. Then he would look at a photograph from 2 years before. He would remember how exquisite she had been, and that would console him a little for taking such pains over her. When the Verdurins carried her off to Saint-Germain, Chateau, Moulin, often, as if it was the warm season, they would propose on the spot, staying there to sleep and not coming back until the next day. Madame Verdurin would try to quiet the scruples of the pianist, whose aunt had remained in Paris. She'll be delighted to be rid of you for a day. And how could she worry? She knows you're with us, Anyway, she cannot put the blame on me. She can put the blame on me. But if she was not successful, Monsieur Verdurin would spring into action, find a telegraph office or messenger, and inquire as to which of the faithful had someone they needed to inform. But Odette would thank him and say that she did not need to send anyone a telegram, because she had told Swann once and for all that by sending him one in front of everybody, she would be compromising herself. Sometimes she would be gone for several days. The Verdurins would take her to see the tombs at Dreux. Dreux. I'm not sure. Or, on the advice of the painter, to Compiègne to admire sunsets as viewed from inside a forest. And then they would push on as far as the Château de Pierrefonds. To think that she could visit real historic buildings with me. I've studied architecture for 10 years, and I'm forever being implored to take people of the highest standing to Beauvais or Saint-Luc de Nantes, and would do it only for her, and instead she goes with the lowest of simpletons to wax ecstatic first over the dejecta of Louis Philippe, and then over those le Duc. It seems to me you don't need to be an artist for that, and even without a particularly delicate nose, you don't choose to go on holiday making in latrines in order to be closer to the smell of excrement. But when she had left for Dreux or Pierrefonds, without, alas, allowing him to go too, as though by chance on his own accord, because that would make a deplorable impression, she said, he would plunge into that most intoxicating of romances, the railway timetable, and which would present him with all the ways he might join her in the afternoon and the evening that same morning. Not only the ways, but even more, almost the authorization, because after all, the timetable and the trains themselves were not meant for dogs. If one informed the public via printed matter that at 8 o'clock in the morning a train left which arrived at Pierrefonds at 10 o'clock, it was because going to Pierrefonds was a lawful act, which for permission from Odette was superfluous, and it was also an act that could have a motive completely different from the desire to meet Odette, since people who did not know her performed it every single day in large enough numbers for it to not be worth the trouble of stoking the locomotives. So she really couldn't stop him from going to Pierrefonds if he wanted to. Now, in fact, he felt he did want to, and that if he did not know Odette, he certainly would have gone. For a long time now, he had wanted to form a clearer idea for himself of Violette le Duc's restoration work, and in this weather he was moved by an imperious desire for a walk in the forest of Compiègne. Page 304.